So start recording. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending this morning. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Ahmed Dami. So he is currently professor in the Department of Horticulture and Crop Science, as well as being state viticulture specialist at the Ohio State University. So he has both research as well as extension responsibilities in viticulture. So his research interests include cold hardness of grapevines and developing methods of cold protection, which he's going to talk about today. He also works on improving fruit and wine quality using cultural practices, as well as germplasm evaluation, as well as matching varieties with climates and sites. So Dr. Dami as well has participated in research assignments throughout the world. Oh, just lost my computer. There we go. So he's been on research assignments and educational tours in Canada, Chile, China, Italy, Tunisia, as well as the United States. He's spoken nationally and internationally. He's also the editor and lead author of an extension book titled Midwest Grape Production Guide. And he co-authored Winter Injury to Grapevines and Methods of Protection. So these were all awarded best extension publications by the American Society of Enology and Viticulture and Horticultural Sciences. He has served as the chair of the ASEV as well, particularly that Eastern section, and he currently serves on the National ASEV board as an academic advisor to the Ohio grape and wine industry organizations for the past 15 years. So thank you again, Ahmed, for joining us, and over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Rob, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, that's good.
All right. So I believe I have my presentation here to share. I'm going to just do the full screen here. You can see it, Rob, right?
Yes, it's full screen.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Rob for the invitation, and Colorado State, Colorado State University for hosting this seminar. Rob actually asked me to present about cold injury in grapevines following the unfortunate cold event that your state experienced last fall. And I'll be happy to share with you my experience with the similar cold events that we had here in Ohio back in 2014, and also share with you what we have learned in terms of assessing, damage as well as managing winter damage vines. Before I start, I'd like to give you an outline about my presentation today. First of all, give you a quick background, and then talk about cold damage. So we need to know what cold damage look like, and then also share with you briefly protection methods available commercially, and then finally go into more details about assessing cold damage, and then also how to manage cold damage in grapevines. I believe Rob just mentioned this actually early on. I would like to bring your attention to this resource. This book, it's an extension book called Winter Injury to Grapevines and Methods of Protection. It is really a very comprehensive book, especially on winter injury on grapevines and discussing method of protection. It's over 100 pages. I highly recommend if you don't have this book. You could buy it through Michigan State University. There are a lot of other extension publications out there. I believe another one probably would be also nice to have from Washington State University. I don't recall the name now, but definitely this book, if you don't have it, I highly recommend. A lot of information I will be sharing with you today is actually from this book. So, speaking about freezing damage, actually, it is possible to have 3 out of this event, 3 out of the 4 seasons. And I'm showing you all the season here. It could happen in the fall, it could happen in the winter, or in the spring. The fall freeze, this is typically coincides, with the killing fall frost. In our industry, the main drawback basically is we have this late ripening varieties, like in this case here, showing you Cabernet Franc. The vines, get defoliated, and the fruit is still hanging. Then what happens is you have this kind of stoppage, basically, of ripening of the fruit, which is not desirable. So it affects more the quality of the fruit than anything else. However, I'm showing with this arrow here, there are regions like you guys in Colorado. I know this is also observed like in the West Coast, like Northwest in Washington State, is the killing fall frost. The temperature gets so cold all of a sudden that not only it damages the buds, but also it damages the vascular system, meaning the trunk. And that could be very devastating, I believe. Speaking with Rob now, and I talked to Horst, this is what happened to the industry in Colorado back in the fall of 2020. The other major freeze event is in the winter. This is more common for us than the fall freeze. And again, it could be very devastating. Typically, we see some bud injury. But at times we may even have trunk injury, like you see this commercial vineyard where all the trunks are being removed, and that could be very devastating. The good thing about this type of injuries or events, they're not as frequent. We may see them once, like in 8 or 10 years. Actually, the last big one that we had, and I'm going to talk about this more, is the polar vortex, in 2014. We have actually two successive events, 2014 and 2015. The other possible freeze damage is during the spring. This is what we call the spring frost. Typically, these events are not lethal to the vine, but they may cause, some crop loss. And typically, they are more frequent, so almost we see these, almost like every year in our industry, but they are more sporadic and they're not as devastating, as the winter. So today I'm going to focus my presentation more on the damage during the winter. I'm sharing with you this slide, which shows grape production on a yearly basis from the two states, Ohio and Colorado. I would like to thank Dr. Horst Kaspari here for sharing with me the stats from Colorado. So as you could see, in addition, to see this up and down, production on a yearly basis in the past 20, 30 plus years. But what I'd like to bring your attention to is where you see these bars on top of these orange bars or red bars, these asterisks, in blue, indicating a drop in crop production, both in Ohio as well as in Colorado. And those significant reduction in crop production is almost always associated with a cold damage event. Whether it is a spring event or winter or even fall, sometimes it is a combination. So again, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is the significance of cold damage on production and economic losses, for both industries. But this is typical really for what we call continental climate region, the Midwest and the Eastern US, to see this type of events. Actually, when I did some kind of an average, on the past few years, we average about like a major, or I call it, cold event every 3 years, which is very frequent. So I'm sure many of you are familiar, what cold damage, look like, but I thought I'll put this slide together and showing you different photos of different, type of injuries from cold. So the first one here, typical during the growing season, you see this what we call blind nodes, kind of space, between shoots, an indication of a cold injury. This is probably not as severe, it means probably the buds, they're dead, but you could see the cordon is still alive. This is a case where the injury is more significant, where you could see here to the left, the cordon is dead. The one to the right here is alive. This is, again, very typical of cold injury, where we have multiple trunks. One trunk is still alive, the other trunk is dead. And that's why you see partial survival of the vine. Again, demonstrating the importance of multiple trunks for training, grapevines in cold regions, like Colorado or in Ohio. If you want to even get a closer look, you could cut. This is cutting through the trunk. I'm sorry, through the cordon. You see this brownish tissue. I'm going to show you more picture later on. Indication of injury. This one here, I'm not sure if you guys have seen this or not. We see it a lot. Basically, the vines, they look all green during the growing season. And then later on in the season, I don't know, maybe like August or so, all of a sudden you see a collapse of a partial part of the vine, maybe half of it, or it depends, on the damage. And that is very typical of cold damage. You don't see it early on, just because of the vines, demand for water is not as big as later on in the season. And then because the vascular system is damaged, the vine cannot keep up, with transpiration, and then all of a sudden, it just collapses. So that is, again, a typical winter injury. Another typical one too is shown in this picture is, well, you observe what we call the presence of crown galls or tumors. You see these typically on top of the graft union or on the trunk, all along, the trunk. Sometimes even you could see it on the cordon as well. And this is caused by a bacterium. Unfortunately, actually, could be very devastating and sometimes even lethal to the vine. But it is something that you cannot get rid of. The bacterium is always on the vines, unfortunately. But the good thing is you could still manage vines, even though they have this bacteria. So again, this is something you may see after winter injury. So on top of retraining, you have to also manage vines to get rid of this crown gall. And then finally, the worst case scenario is, complete death, of the vine. This is kind of the worst case scenario. Not only you have a dieback, but also a death of the vine. I also would like to share with you a lot of methods, out there available commercially. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talk about this today, but the good thing is there are ways of avoiding or mitigating, or at least minimizing cold injury in the vineyard. And by far, the best way is through site and variety selection. I'm sure you've heard this many times, but really, it is the best way to avoid or at least minimize, damage, to your vineyard. I will talk more about this here in a minute. Cultural practices are important as well. What I call here crop adjustment. How you control or you crop your vines is important. I will also talk about this in a minute. The other preventative method, what we call graft union protection. This is very typical in our industry, basically healing up, the base of the vines, and I'm going to talk about this again. One of the methods, what we call active method is the use of wind machines. They are expensive, but they are very effective. Here in Ohio, we don't only use them during the spring, but growers use them even during the fall and even in the winter. And actually, they could be effective even in the winter when the weather conditions are suitable for that. I'm going to touch also a little bit on some of the research we've done on spraying chemicals to improve cold hardness. So, as I mentioned early on, site and variety selection is very important. This is probably the most important decision as a grower that you make when you establish a new vineyard. It's not an easy decision, but it is very crucial because you make it, for the lifespan of the vineyard. I'm showing you an example here where there are two varieties planted, next to each other. Vidal Blanc is a hybrid, and then Cabernet Franc is a vinifera. This vineyard really is well maintained. The grower did a very good job in terms of cultural practices. However, it got cold enough in this vineyard that the Vidal Blanc survived, but not the Cabernet Franc. So even though these two varieties, they're very close in terms of cold hardness, could be like a couple of degrees difference, but those couple of degrees could mean the difference, between live and dead vine. So what this slide demonstrates is this variety, Cabernet Franc, is not suitable, in this site. So very important to make, the proper selection of varieties. And I'm sure you guys, working with Horst and Rob, that could help out in terms of selecting, best varieties for your site. This is another example showing you the large variability of cold hardness of grape species and varieties, which is a good thing. So we have a lot of choices to make, in terms of cold hardness. I'm sharing with you this slide where we collected the level of injury following cold events in Ohio. These are two of our research vineyard. This black or solid bars is one site in Worcester where temperature dropped to -15 Fahrenheit. And then here, this white or open bars is located in Kingsville, where temperature dropped to -11. So if you look at the one here in Worcester, you could see the big difference. The y-axis here showing the bud injury percent, and here are the varieties. And as you could see to the left here, the highest bud injury was sustained in the Vitis vinifera varieties, which is expected. The example here, Cabernet Franc, Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, ranging between over 85% to 100% damage from the event. And then right next to it, what I call moderately tender Chambourcin, then moderately hardy, what we call the old hybrids or the French hybrids, like Vidal, Chevron. And then as we go to the right here, you see more and more hardy hybrids. These are new hybrids, either from New York or from Minnesota. For example, you could see the Traminette, Chardonnay, what we call moderately hardy. And then you get to the group of very hardy or super hardy varieties. These are mostly from Minnesota Examples include, like Crescent, Frontenac, Gris, Marquette, etc. So you could see at -15, they sustain only about the 10% damage, whereas the vinifera almost sustained 100%. So what this demonstrates is there is a very large variation in terms of cold hardness between these varieties. The other thing also I'd like to point out is the site, and how cold it got there. The second site got down to only -11. So obviously it was not as cold. And you could see the injury was not as severe. For example, if you look at the Cabernet Franc here, sustained just a little over 50%, whereas in this case here at -15, sustained almost 100%. And then you see Chardonnay. Again, differences between the varieties. You could see Chardonnay is more hardy than Cabernet Franc, sustained about 25% injury compared to here over 95. Limburger also did very well, just over 20%. And then again, you see some of the hybrids like Traminette only sustained, about 10% at -11 compared to the one here sustaining 40%. So very important to know how cold it got into the site, and the response of those varieties. I mentioned earlier cultural practices and the importance of, if you want to call it the crop size or the crop load, and it is its influence on the response of the vine in terms of cold injury. This is something, in my opinion, typically underestimated or underappreciated, the impact of crop load on vine injury from cold. So I'm sharing with you here a trial that we did years ago on Chambourcin. And basically the main purpose of the trial is we tried the different crop loads through cluster thinning, where we have target cluster thinning 10, 20, and 30. They are approximately equivalent to 4 tons, 5 tons, and 6 tons to the acre. So what we found following a cold event where it dropped to 0 degree, the level of primary bud injury was 22% with vines that were cropped at 4 tons to the acre. However, when we increased to 5 tons to the acre, the bud injury doubled. And then increasing it again to 6 tons to the acre, bud injury tripled. So there is almost, well, not almost, linear relationship between increasing the crop level and the increase of bud injury as well. So again, it shows you having overcropped vines is not desirable, and then you may end up with more injury after cold events like what you guys experience, or even in the winter. This study here, actually, we conducted for 5 years. At the end of 5 years, the vines actually from the 20 and the 30 clusters per vine were considered overcropped. And with the 30 clusters per vine, these are the ones that basically have close to 6 tons of the acre. We lost at the end of this trial a third of the vines. So sometimes you don't see, the impact in 1 year, but over the year there is a cumulative effect, and we lost a third. I mean, the vines were completely dead at the end of the experiment. Even though this experiment was conducted with the hybrid, we saw similar things with the vinifera. And typically, I guess as a rule of thumb, varieties, whether they're vinifera or hybrid, that tend to overcrop are the ones that also tend to sustain more cold injury if they're not cluster thin. Another important cultural practice, as I mentioned earlier, is graft union protection. This is a practice of hilling and dehilling vines This is basically for us in Ohio. It is done in all vinifera. The main reason, obviously, they are grafted to protect from phylloxera, and it consists of healing up, creating this mound around this time of the year. And that mound actually not only protects the graft union, but also protects the base of the scion. And it is like an insurance policy for the worst case scenario, which you guys experienced, last fall, and we did experience here as well, where it gets cold enough that anything above the ground or above the mound die back, and anything that is covered by this mound will survive. So basically, you could retrain the vines. So it is a very effective method. I understand, actually, I visited Colorado a few years ago, that in your state right now, there is confirmation of the presence of phylloxera. And I think I saw more and more growers planting their vinifera on grafted rootstock. So I'm sure that's going to be the standard practice in future years. Just to share with you, like I said earlier, the things that we learned, from this polar vortex we had in 2014. So in the fall before that year, in 2013, like every fall, we healed up the vines and we protected the graft union, like it's shown here in this the left picture. And then the following winter, in January, when we experienced this killing event, unfortunately, typically we have a snow cover also in addition to the soil mound. We didn't have that year. Precipitation was in the form of very heavy rain, and what it did, it eroded the soil mound. So what happened is we had kind of the soil mound was receded, and as you could see in this picture here, there was exposure of the graft union. Unfortunately, at the time, many of the vines were exposed. And what happened, we collected the data, after the freezing event in 2 locations in our research vineyard in Worcester. We had 100% of the graft union that were exposed, unfortunately. In another location, Kingsville, was only 20%. Then we went back and did the assessment after the cold event in the summer, and we lost close to 70% of the vines. I mean, these were not, they didn't die back, they were completely dead. In Kingsville, only 20%. So again, it shows you how important it is to have this amount, to protect the graft union and the scion. Another thing here that we did in terms of research, we sometimes try, different chemicals that we spray and see how the vines do, and at the time, we tried this growth regulator. It's called abscisic acid. It is available commercially under the name of Proton. And this growth regulator, actually, it is sold and registered for table grapes for the main reason to enhance color, okay? So for us at the time, we didn't use it for that purpose. Well, we did, for wine grapes. But for me, I was more interested, to see whether abscisic acid, improve cold hardness, and it did. We found concentration between 400 and 600 parts per million, improved cold hardness by 1 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very significant. And it did this with all the varieties that we tested at the time. We also didn't know the best timing, and we found out that the best timing was around the veraison, or just after veraison, maybe a couple of weeks later on. So it happened that during our trials, for a few years, we had a major cold event, and we collected the data in this plot that you're showing here, where we measured survival of the buds, and then here we have the different treatments. So at the time, after this cold event, we had a little over 30% survival from the control. The control vines are basically not treated with abscisic acid. And then the green bars here are the ones that were treated. And we observed that the ones that were treated around veraison, and 20 days after veraison, we almost had double the survival of the buds. So it was really very effective. So again, it's another tool, in your toolbox of protection. It's definitely not the silver bullet, but it is something that we use, and it worked. So, even though as a grower, you do all that needs to be done, in terms of prevention or preparation of the vines, to overwinter, whether it is hilling up the vines, adjusting the crop, fertilization, irrigation, everything, done properly. Still, it gets cold enough during the winter that it doesn't matter, all these practices, and unfortunately, you may observe some damage. So to assess, whether you have any damage or not, again, this is typical. You collect canes from the vineyard. I'm showing you here an example where we do this. Typically, every time we have a cold event, we collect about 100 buds, for each variety. I'm showing you a picture here of a temperature logger. I think it's a good investment to have in your vineyard. They're getting very cheap, so to know how cold it got in your vineyard. But also, you could use that temperature logger to even monitor things like growing degree days, during the growing season. So it is typical when you do these collections to collect, canes for each variety. Sometimes you have the same variety, but it is grown in 2 different blocks. So it would be good also to collect, let's say it's Chardonnay, to collect it from those 2 different blocks, because you may have a different response, in terms of to cold injury. Another thing also I'd like to bring to your attention that I observed in one of the vineyards here in Ohio, one of our kind of larger operations, where even within, you can see here different rows, these different blocks of varieties, and then here showing you the same variety. Even sometimes within the same block of the variety, you may see differences in terms of bud injury. Like I'm showing in this example. These rows are so long, they're over 600 feet, that we observe variation between one end of the row to the other end of the row. There's a very slight slope, but definitely there is what I call a lower end of the vineyard and the higher end. And when we measured the percent of survival at the lower end, we had a 20 to 40% survival rate. And then the higher end was 80 to 90%. So if you are a grower and typically you collect 100 canes, from the whole block, you may end up with an average of 75%. And you're going to say, well, not much damage, really. Sometimes with those levels, you do very minor adjustment of pruning or not adjustment at all. However, that is not true. And that is not really a good approach, because the bottom of that vineyard have not almost, double to 4 times the amount of injury here. So definitely the lower end of the vineyard has to be pruned differently than the higher end of that vineyard. I'm just saying, I'm not saying that this is something you will see all the time, but again, like if you have big operations, you may see some differences, in terms of growth, or you have more soil moisture, at the lower end of the vineyard. You may consider to collect some samples, to see whether you see these differences. So then once you collect the canes, you bring them inside and you let them thaw for 24, 48 hours. And this is what the injury look like in different parts of the vine. I'm showing you here buds, canes, and trunks. Very easy to determine injury. If the tissue is green, it's alive, like it is shown here in buds, canes, and trunks. When you have injury, it turns brown. So something very peculiar about grape buds is what we call, they are compound buds. You have primary, secondary, and tertiary buds. The fruit typically comes from the primary bud. Unfortunately, the primary bud is the most sensitive among all those buds. And this is why you see injury first on the primary bud. In terms of the cane, again, this is more like to show you, typically we see the first injury on what we call the phloem. The cambium you cannot see, but you see the phloem. Like here, injured, you could see it turns a brown color. Okay, if you do a cross section, you see brown, right next end of the bark. And then as it gets colder and it gets worse with the trunk, live trunks, you may see green. Sometimes they look cream color. So even though they look cream, they're still alive. When they turn brown, again, the phloem, that means it is injured. And then injury gets worse, when you even have the phloem and the xylem damage, basically those are there. So I'm not suggesting that you need to do all these. I'm just showing you what the injury looked like. But as a grower, best thing to do is you collect the canes and you assess buds only, because the buds are the most sensitive part of the vine. So again, as I mentioned earlier, another peculiarity about grape buds is they don't all have the same level of cold hardness. Typically, the primary buds are the most tender, followed by the secondary buds, followed by the tertiary buds. I'm just showing you an example here of different varieties. This is really doesn't matter whether it is a vinifera or a hybrid. We see this phenomenon in all these varieties. For example, if you look at Cabernet Franc, percent of primary bud injury was 48, secondary was 42, and the tertiary was 26. As I mentioned earlier, and again, unfortunately, the primary buds, is the most sensitive, and it is the one that produces the full crop. Okay, so if you have injury here, that means you're not going to have a full crop. Then you're going to rely on the secondary buds. Secondary buds typically produce, maybe 25 to 30% of the crop. So they produce some crop. So it is also important to assess the survival of secondary buds. The tertiary buds, typically, they don't produce anything, okay? So they are non-productive. Even though they are alive, you may get shoots out of them, but you won't get any crop from that. Another thing, again, peculiar about grapes or grapevines is the cane. So the bud position on the cane or the buds have different cold hardness, depends on their position on the cane. So typically we have 3 positions, what we call basal. This is that goes from node 1 to node 5, or bud 1 to bud 5, middle, and then the apical. So this is a tip of the cane. And typically the basal buds are the most cold hard, followed by the middle, and then the apical buds are the least cold hard. Okay. Again, we observe this in all kinds of grapes, whether they're hybrids or vinifera. This is, for example, Sauvignon Blanc. If you do an average, it's a 44% primary bud injury. However, if we break down that average into by position, as you could see, the basal buds have only 27% damage, 50% in the middle, and 54% in the apical. And actually, again, this shows you why when we do pruning, you do the spur pruning, because the spurs, which are the basal buds, are the hardiest one compared to the apical one. So once you did all your assessment and you kind of tabled, the primary, secondary buds, then you could use this chart. Again, all this information is in this book. So I'm going to talk more in general here. Typically, when you have injury less than 15%, being conservative here, you don't need to do any pruning adjustment. Okay, and then as the injury increases, you have to adjust the bud number by increasing bud number when you do the pruning. So anytime we have a bud injury, you could compensate for that through pruning. So it is very important to do this right before pruning. These are things to keep in mind when you do this. Like I mentioned earlier, it is best to spur prune. If you leave the spurs, it is better to leave more spurs than longer spurs. Okay. And then also, if you typically use the cane prunings, in our industry, cane pruning is common, and you have a severe bud injury, definitely you need to convert your vineyards into spur pruning, because the canes, as I showed earlier, you're going to have half of it almost dead. They're not productive. They don't have a uniform bud break. And definitely over the years, we did this many times. It is not recommended. So I'm sharing with you here some of the actual data that we collected following a freeze event, and going through the different scenarios of pruning. So this first column here showing different varieties of vinifera. Actually, we have them ranked based on primary bud injury, with the Chardonnay having the least injury. Here, in this case, you have Moscato having the most injury at 100%. We also collected the secondary bud injury as well. And then in this column here, I'm showing you what kind of pruning adjustment we did. In this case, typically, if we don't make any adjustment, we leave 36 buds per vine. So the first four varieties, as you could see, bud injury was less than 15%. And then again, based on that chart I showed you earlier, we didn't need to do any adjustment for pruning. Okay. This last two columns, it shows here shoots per vine and then a cluster per vine. I would say for like an optimum yield, again, depends on the variety, but I would say, just to make it easier here for the sake of the presentation, the target, cluster number is about 50. So you could see in this case, all of them produced more than 50 clusters. So that means we had to do a cluster thinning in this case, which means that we had a full crop, which is expected. The ones that are highlighted in yellow, we had the injury between 25 and 50%, Cabernet Franc, Pinotage, Gruner. And again, in this case, we have to adjust the bud number based on a formula. And again, by adjusting bud number, we end up with, look at the number of clusters. And again, our cluster target number is 50. So we had to do cluster thinning of these vines as well, meaning that even with those levels of injury, we still end up with a full crop. This category here, the one highlighted in green, higher percent of bud injury, 60 to 80%. In this case, when you get to this level, you're going to do what we call a minimum pruning or a hedge pruning. And that's what we did in this case, where we just hedged the vines. That means we left all the spurs, and these spurs have 5 buds on them. And again, even with this high level of injury, I mean, you look at Sauvignon Blanc, almost 80%, we still ended up with our target cluster number of 50, which is amazing, So that means we still end up with a normal crop. Ortega was less. So even though the bud injury is very high, it doesn't mean that you're going to lose the equivalent of crop from those varieties. So again, very important to adjust for pruning. The last two varieties highlight in gray, Durif, this is Petit Syrah and Moscato. Once you get into this 90%, 100% bud injury, it is almost always indication that you're going to have trunk damage. Okay. You know, at the time when you do this, nothing is growing yet, you know, but most likely, you know, you're going to have some trunk damage. And it was, you know, we looked later on, you could see there's no shoots, no yield at all. And basically, you have to prepare yourself for retraining the trunks. So to summarize this, we have two major scenarios, what I call bud damage. In that case, you could adjust or manage vines by adjusting pruning. The second scenario is when you have a trunk damage, like as shown in these two varieties. In this case, you have to prepare yourself for trunk renewal. And I understand, speaking with Horst and Rob here, that this is what happened for your industry last fall. Another example showing yield after cold injury. I've shown you early on examples of vinifera. This is the same thing with hybrids. As you could see, Frontenac, we had over 40% damage. Then we did the hedging, and you could see we have 6.8 tons with that type of injury. It was even higher than our 4-year average. La Crescent, we end up with 7.8 tons with 38% damage. Marquette, actually, we double the yield at 45%. Aromella, we had more damage, but still, it was not a complete loss. We still end up with some crop. So again, the message here is percent damage does not equate to a crop loss. So in my next part of this presentation, I'm going to focus on talking on the second scenario, where you had 100%, you know, bud damage, and then basically for you to find out, I know this question at the time was asked a lot, you know, how you prune your vines, do you hedge them? You know, it is best really to be patient and just wait for the vines to grow back again in the spring, and then you could make an easier decision. So like that, for example, in this case, you could see everything above the ground here died. Okay, so then, however, we protected, you know, the base of the trunk, and then we have these new shoots, or what we call suckers, and those would be basically, you have to retrain those. Again, you know, this is back in 2014, what our industry faced, basically complete wipe out of vinifera, and ended up, as you could see in this commercial vineyard, cutting all the trunks, and then you could see, I mean, these vines, obviously, they were healed up, so you see a lot of suckers. At the time, a lot of questions about, you know, suckers, you know, how many to leave, you know, what to leave, etc. And we did a lot of trials, try to answer those questions. So again, we did a lot of work on this, but I'm just showing you some of the main things that we found. So in this first scenario, the top 3 pictures is showing what I call a minimum training. So what that means is after you cut the trunks, you're going to train the suckers. So how do you train them? The first scenario here is what we call fan training, is you just let the vines grow. You let the shoots grow vertically, very minimum work. You know, they're going to just climb, you know, and then attach, you know, to the catch wires. This is what the vines look like in the summer. You know, it's called fan because it looks like a fan shape. And then later on in the fall, this is what the vine looked like. Okay, so the advantage of this is there's very minimum work involved. Okay, the disadvantage is the vines are not trained at all. In the second scenario here, what we did is we trained what I call active training. As the vines grow in the spring and in the summer, we were training them. Like you see in this case here, we took the 2 shoots, laid them down, you know, tied them down, and as soon as you tie them down, they're going to grow laterals. And then in the summer, these laterals, you know, fill the canopy. These are VSP trained system. And then by the end of the summer and the fall, you already established your cordon and most of your canes and spurs. So this is the advantage of this, is you could train the vines on the same year that you have the damage. The disadvantage is the labor, very labor intensive. Okay. So realistically, back in 2014, most of our commercial vineyards really, during the growing season, you don't have that kind of labor, so they just let the vine grow, and they train them with this fan system, and which I call option one. And coincidentally, we did a lot of research on this. We found actually that was the best choice. So I'm glad growers did that at the time, but that was really, at the time, again, they didn't have a choice because of labor. But in terms of vine physiology and the training, it is the best option. So I'm just showing you these pictures again. If you have a VSP system, you have the young suckers here growing. In the summer, again, they're trained as a fan. So basically, you convert the VSP to a fan training system. And then in the fall, you're going to have something looking like this. You could see there's a lot of canes. Those are your future trunks. So this is all in year one of training. Showing you a close-up. In our conditions, because obviously here it's very wet, in the east. We don't control, growth of vines like you guys do with irrigation. So sometimes, especially with younger vines, you get like, in this case, we have like more than 10 suckers, growing at one time. So the message here is leave as many as you can, if possible. So in year one, really, you don't make any selection. You are just letting the vines grow. And this is what the vines look like, late fall after the freeze. You could see how many canes we have. This is a trunk, it has to be removed. But then you have a lot of canes. The other advantage of leaving this many shoots is we're trying to devigorate the vine. We want to reduce the vigor of these shoots. Okay. See, like in this case here, all these shoots have a nice size. And I'm sure you've heard about what we call ball cane. These are large canes. And, they always say that they're not good, to leave. So what we did that year, we want to test them because we keep hearing, they're not hardy. So we did a trial, actually, a study where we selected, 3 types of sizes, small, medium, and large, from the same vines. We tagged them, and then we collected them, and we did a freezing test where we did the assessment of cold hardness. And what we found is that the large canes here, what we call ball canes, they have 4 to 11 degrees. They are less cold hardy than the small and medium size, which is, even for me, I was surprised. I was expecting a couple of degrees, but it was a very significant difference. So definitely, when you encounter the situation, and I'm showing you here the size, what we call medium, about the pencil size, you want to select this size versus this size. Okay. More information about what we call ball canes, because we observe them, we measure them, and typically, of course, they vary from one variety to another. This example here, I'm showing you Cabernet Franc. Typically, they grow very fast. They have very rapid and vigorous growth. They have very long internodes, 5 to 6 inches, very large diameter, more than half an inch. Sometimes you see these stems, they look flattened, and then they have a lot of laterals. Okay, so when you walk into a vineyard, it's very apparent. You could see when we count the number of laterals, they're always highly significant compared to the other vines. And typically, they're not very fruitful. And again, the most important thing is they are more cold tender. Okay, so definitely when you see these, and then after the killing frost, I'm showing you here an example where we have 4 trunks or 4 canes, to become trunks. These 2 here, they need to be removed. Okay, hopefully you have a choice to keep these 2, but as much as you can, do not keep these because they're not going to survive, through the winter. I believe this is my last slide. I would like to conclude showing you more resources, this is from our website. I understand you guys in your state probably you applied for some kind of disaster, assistant, so I want to share with you what we did back in 2014. A similar situation where our state, applied for federal assistance, and we received it. There are different programs. At the time, they have this program called the TAP, Tree Assistance Program. It's in the form of a grant. Our growers at the time, they were compensated, or I guess reimbursed, for purchasing vines. And there are other programs, like low interest loans, etc. I'm going to do very quickly here. This is our website, what it looks like. You could Google, Buckeye appellation. And I have a couple of handouts I'd like to share with you guys. So I'm going to go quickly here to this site. It's going to take me a minute, if I can. So this is our website. You go under grape growing right here. You click on it. And then you go down all the way, scroll down to what I call, it's called Managing Winter Damaged Grapevines. And then you click on it. And then it shows, cold damage, winter, spring, and summer. Click on summer. And you have this handout. Okay, it's a PDF form. The reason why I'm sharing this with you, because at the time when we had this cold event, the polar vortex, a lot of this agent from FSA, the Farm Service Agency, they are basically the inspectors, they're going to come to your vineyard. At the time, they have no experience whatsoever with grapes. They are familiar with assistance to corn and soybean. Obviously Ohio is a corn and soybean state, but they have no clue about grapes. So at the time, what I did is we developed this handout to educate them. And we did a lot of workshops specifically for this agent, not only to growers, but also to this agent. And we have, dozens of them attending these workshops. And this handout, really, the advantage is we develop a template that they use when they went to the vineyard, because they don't know how to do it, okay? And a lot of time in the beginning of this process, they did it not correctly. So it kind of hurt the growers. So we developed this handout, and this template, actually, they end up using it when they went out to the vineyard. And I'm sure you're going to learn about terminology like rehabilitation, etc. So I'm not going to go through all these, but showing you, it has pictures, different scenarios, and then at the end, they assess, whether your vines are damaged or not, So I would definitely, I know this is kind of late. At the time grows, they have to take pictures and etc. But even for your own information, if this is late, I think would be good to take a look at this handout. I believe with that, let's see. I think that's my last slide. If you have any questions for me after this meeting, please feel free to email me at dami.1@osu.edu. And with that, I thank you so much for your attention. I hope we have time for questions. I know it's 4 o'clock now.
Excellent. Thank you, Ahmed. That was an excellent presentation. I think that that really complements some of the presentations that Horst has done in the last couple of years, but it's that's also added a lot of good new information as well, and perspective from Ohio as well. So yeah, so with that, if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute and ask, or feel free to type in the chat box and I will read them out.
Ahmed, it's Horst here.
Yes.
I wonder if you could comment on using laterals on bull canes. If, for example, you had a mild winter where you expect the bull not to be damaged, but then choosing a lateral to train rather than the bull itself.
Okay. The answer is yes. Let's see here if I could go back to my presentation. We did that horse. It was not the favorite thing for me to do, but at times, you know, I believe I showed this picture. Sometimes you don't have a choice, you know, like you only have these two type of canes, you know, to train as a trunk, and you hope, you know, that you have a mild winter. There are times what my understanding from horse is you have like a ball cane, but then it have laterals, and then you could grow that lateral as your new trunk. And actually we did that, yeah. So it is possible. Again, you know, you always hope for a mild winter, but yes. Viticulture is always about improvising, right?
Correct.
Any other questions or comments?
Ahmed, could you explain a little bit more about how abscisic acid, the ABA treatment, how that kind of raises the cold hardiness of grapevines?
That is a very good question. Actually, when we did the application at the time, it's like, you know, you spray and pray, see whether it works or not, you know, and then afterwards, you know, we have to find out, you know, how and why, you know, it worked. You know, if you don't mind, Rob, you could send me an email. We just published a new paper, I believe, last year on the mechanism, you know. But
Okay.
briefly, abscisic acid, you know, if you want to call it, you know, like a dormant, you know, growth regulator, that was our kind of like a first, you know, basis of our hypothesis, you know, is by spraying it, you know, we are basically forcing the vines to go into dormancy, you know, and then basically start to cold acclimate earlier than normal. And that's exactly what happened. So the vines, you know, when they did that, they also gained, you know, cold hardness. Then to answer your question, one of the things when we talk about cold hardness, is the vines always accumulate, you know, more reserves, more sugars for protection purposes. And what we found is ABA actually promotes that, okay? And we looked at very specific sugars, the group that we call raphinols, family oligosaccharides, and ABA, you know, promote those sugars. And we found that actually those sugars accumulate, they induce this dormancy, and then they increase cold hardness of the grapevines. Did I answer the question?
Yes, yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. Excellent.
And just a comment, Ahmed, I mean, you and I have talked about this many, many times. We've done the same studies and more and others, and we've been up to 1,500 parts ABA, and we've seen squat, absolutely zero on just about every single study we've done, repeat applications, different timings. So it's definitely something that's not universally applicable. For whatever reason, it does not seem to work here in Colorado, which I think might have to do with how rapidly we actually do acclimate when we do get cold. It certainly totally overrides any ABA signaling. Having said that, last year we had very good success with it with peaches, and this year again almost none.
Okay.
So it really is, you know, that I think the fall conditions determine if you're successful or not with this application, and our ones don't seem to be favoring it.
Well, Howard, thanks for the comment. And yes, I know when we present our research results, we always show the good part of it, you know, and then when you repeat them for a few years, you realize that sometimes, unfortunately, it's not consistent. I agree with you. I think what's happening again, you know, it would be interesting, you know, to do further studies is if I look at Colorado, you know, because I know we did this project also with other states, you know, like in British Columbia, in Canada, like Ontario, is it's almost like has to do with whether you have like a wet region or a dry region, you know. I think with dry region, probably because the vines, you know, they're more, they're drier, you know, kind of almost more exposed to some kind of drought stress. They produce more ABA. So you already have ABA, you know, to begin with, you know, like high amounts.
Yep.
And most likely, like in our region, because it's very wet, you know, we don't have the same level, even probably water content. We may have less ABA. So by the time when we add ABA, it kind of compensated, you know, for that, what we call endogenous ABA, and may trigger, you know, more response than what you guys see. Again, you know, this is a hypothesis, but, you know, it is possible that's what's going on. When we do the experiment in the greenhouse, consistently, you know, we always see responses, you know, from ABA, especially the dormancy, you know, it's very, very typical.
We have had one study, Matt, where with a analog, we had really great success, but it was at the other end of the season. We delayed bud break significantly, and that year we had a spring frost, and you know, the ABA analog treated vines came out much later and totally missed the spring frost. So there's a lot more to be learned from ABA.
Yeah. Actually, I'm familiar with that work, Horst, because when I worked with colleagues in British Columbia, they were doing the same thing. I didn't mention this in my presentation. The ABA that we use, you know, is this commercially available ABA. And we looked at bud break delay because that was also our interest. It didn't really cause bud break delay. However, the analog form did cause bud break delay. I didn't do the work, you know, but the work done in British Columbia. I know right now there's more work being done in the East, in Virginia, in Pennsylvania, in Ontario. They are finding the same thing, very significant bud break delay. My understanding is obviously there are two different forms of ABA. The one that we are using and kind of the explanation, it is quickly metabolized in the vine. Okay, so imagine when we spray it, you know, in the summer, it doesn't really last all the way to next spring, you know, in terms of its impact. However, the analog persists longer in terms of being metabolized. It's much slower metabolized, you know, form of ABA, and that is one of the explanations, you know, why it is impactful. But I agree with you. Very consistently, other colleagues of mine, they are observing the same thing in terms of its impact on bud break delay and prevention of spring frost.
Thanks, Ben.
Sure.
Ahmed, you mentioned in terms of overcropping, having too many clusters can actually lead to increased bud damage kind of subsequently. Could you explain a little bit about kind of the link between that?
Okay, so basic, your question, Rob, is about the crop level and its impact on cold injury?
Yes.
So again, this is, I don't know if you want to call it controversial, but, you know, viticulture really is site specific, you know. Like in the West Coast, specifically, a lot of work being done, you know, at Washington State. Actually, me, in my old days, when I was in Colorado, I did some work on these too. When you change, you know, the crop level or you increase the crop level, we didn't see an impact on cold hardness. Same thing in Washington State, work done by Marcus Keller. When they increase, crop level, basically, increasing the yield, per vine or per acre, they didn't see any impact on the vine, on the winter injury. However, here in Ohio, we do see an impact. My explanation of that is, again, goes back to the carbohydrates, because I recall when I did this work, back then, we looked at these carbohydrates. We found no differences, between high crop and low crop vines. Same thing with the work done at Washington State. They didn't see any difference, So the explanation that was proposed is, for example, in Colorado, there is so much sunlight, same in Washington State, the eastern part, that the vine produced enough photosynthase, and carbohydrates, that the vines really have enough reserves that you don't see that impacting cold hardness, later on in the season. That is not the case, for us in Ohio. We don't have the level of sunlight that you guys do. Actually, the lake makes it even worse, with more cloudy days. At least, that is my explanation. I've seen it consistently. So I would always argue that the crop level, in our region, probably in the east, really is impacted. Actually, after the polar vortex back in 2014, I did a lot of visits, to vineyards, and I've seen it. A lot of overcrop vines, like typical varieties, like Cayuga, Save-All, even though Save-All is very, well, it is, it has a decent cold hardness, dead to the ground, because they were way overcropped. And we see this more right now with our trials of vinifera. Some varieties tend to overcrop. If we don't thin them, we could see some differences on about cold hardness. So again, just like this ABA thing, it is regional, and my suspicion is it has to do really with how much reserve at the end of the season the vines have, to prepare themselves for the winter.
Yeah, that's good. That's a great answer. Thank you.
And just to add one point to that, I mean, it's implied, but overcropping a cultivar you harvest in the middle of August when you have 3 months of post-harvest is not a problem. We're talking here about, varieties that are ripening late that do not have post-harvest period at all if you overcrop.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Horst. And again, we see that a lot here in Ohio. I mean, sometimes, like when you compare vinifera varieties in terms of their cold hardness, what we see here is a little bit different, about ranking that, let's say, what you see in Colorado. One good example is Pinot Gris. Pinot Gris is one of our most cold hardy varieties, almost as hardy as Riesling, and definitely more hardy than Chardonnay. And the main reason is Pinot Gris is harvested very early in the season. So they have, when I say early for us, is like early, mid-September. So they have a lot of time, with the leaves on the vines to even have more reserves, more photosynthase for the vines, to prepare for the cold winters. As compared to, let's say, Cabernet Franc. Cabernet Franc is a very late variety. And a lot of times, by the time you pick them, you may have another week, of live leaves, before the killing frost. And they don't do as well in terms of winter hardness for us among vinifera.
Excellent. Well, I see no more questions in the chat, so I think with that, we'll end it there. So yeah, thank you very much, Imad. It was a pleasure to have you on today. We really appreciate the information you could provide us. Obviously, it's a huge issue here this year, so I think that's good timely information for everybody. So yeah, we thank you for coming on, and we'll make this presentation available online as well for any other growers who couldn't make it.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. Thank you for our attendees as well.
Thanks, Imad. Take care.
All right. Good luck, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.